Well, hello there, you're watching the press preview. A first look at what is on the front pages. In the next half hour, then, we'll see what's making the headlines with the Observer's chief leader writer Sonia Sodha and the political journalist and author Isabel Oakeshott. Great to see you. Plenty to talk about tonight, so let's check out the front pages. Rule of 6 months, that's the splash for the Metro, highlighting the government's newly announced COVID-19 measures and the plan to keep them in place until at least March next year. The Telegraph quotes the Prime Minister saying there are difficult months to come. The fight against COVID is by no means over. The Times does similar, but goes with the line, a struggle that humanity will win. The Financial Times points out Mr Johnson's warning that perilous times lie ahead. Scotland's Courier says the nation is braced for a long and lonely winter. The Eye reports that experts have told the Prime Minister the new rules aren't the answer to slowing the infection rate. The Daily Mail describes the new measures as draconian. Boris gives UK both barrels, the paper says. And there you can see The Guardian leading on the Prime Minister's warning that unless the new measures are adhered to, there could be a second national lockdown. Boris in Last Chance Saloon, declares the Daily Mirror, implying his political success or failure lies in whether or not the initiative will work. And the Star says, that it? Well, before we debate those stories, here's a quick reminder then of what the Prime Minister had to say in tonight's address to the nation.
Unless we take action, the risk is that we will have to go for tougher measures later, when the deaths have already mounted and we have a huge caseload of infection, such as we had in the spring. If we let this virus get out of control now, it would mean that our NHS had no space, once again, to deal with cancer patients and millions of other non-COVID medical needs. And if we were forced into a new national lockdown, that would threaten not just jobs and livelihoods, but the loving human contact on which we all depend.
Well, we're joined, as you can see, by Sonia Sodha and Isabel Oakeshott. Quite a night, quite a day, I suppose. Sonia, you kick off then. Daily Telegraph summing it up, I suppose, for all of us. There are difficult months to come.
Yeah, so it's obviously the only story on the front pages this evening. I think there's a sense of inevitability about this moment. We've been seeing infection rates tick up. Experts become very worried about it in recent days, in weeks in the UK. And there's been a lot of looking to France and Spain, who are thought to be a few weeks ahead of us, where infections are at much higher rates. And they're also starting to see hospitalisation and death rates creep up as well. There are really sort of two main things that the Prime Minister focused on in his statement for England in terms of new restrictions. There's a 10 p.m. curfew on hospitality, on pubs and restaurants, and there's a sort of new edict for workers, which is that if you do have an office job and you can work from home, you should, which is obviously very different from what the government's been saying over the summer. So the big question, I think, is, first of all, how long might these restrictions need to go on for? Is quite a sober moment, I think, when the Prime Minister sort of alluded to the fact that this might be going on for 6 months. That's over things like Christmas. But the other big question is, do these restrictions go quickly enough? And you can see a big contrast between what's happening here in England and Scotland, where Nicola Sturgeon, addressing Scotland today, took the decision on the behalf of the Scottish Government to go even further and to introduce limits on household mixing. So in Scotland, households are now not allowed to mix indoors in private homes, with some exemptions. Now, we're obviously seeing that in some areas of England, but the government is hoping to keep that for local lockdowns at the moment. So I think that is the big debate tonight. We know from earlier in the year that acting too late can have very, very serious consequences, and the government is trying to walk this fine line. I think nobody really knows the extent to which they've got it right, but looking at France and Spain, it is really worrying. So that is really the big question, I think, that overhangs the government.
Yeah, apologies, I didn't mean to cut you off there. But Isabel, certainly there had been some surprise surprised that the indoor rule of 6 was not changed for England. The suggestion being that you could close a pub at 10 and then 6 friends could all go around someone's house and carry on drinking. There've always been difficulties with some of these rules, haven't there?
Well, I mean, I was just absolutely flabbergasted by the Prime Minister's speech. And I think some of the headlines in tomorrow's paper barely do the hyperbole justice. I mean, this was quite extraordinary from a libertarian Prime Minister who is busy pretty much saying he's going to impose martial law. He's bringing in the threat of bringing in the army to reinforce these unbelievably draconian measures. Yes, infection rates are going up somewhat, but the number of deaths remains very, very minimal. Now, I'm not for a minute saying that this isn't a very, very nasty virus, but the option remains simply to support the vulnerable and the elderly, those who are most likely to be worst affected by it, to shield, and then the rest of the nation to continue. And I'm absolutely stunned at how uncritical tomorrow's front pages are. I mean, the Mail does strike a slightly different note, and certainly inside the pages of the Mail, we have a bit more scepticism. But, you know, you have dozens of medical experts in today's papers, not tomorrow's papers, but existing coverage, who are raising very, very serious questions about whether or not this is the right strategy. So I thought it was quite an extraordinary moment from the Prime Minister. And to say that we'll have this for the next 6 months without any kind of review in the interim, except possibly a review that makes things worse, I don't know. It seems to me he's lost the plot.
The Metro then rule of 6 months, talking about the army being on standby. This is a balance between persuasion and penalty. Certainly the police are having a much greater role, as you say, to enforce the legally binding rules that are now upon all of us and businesses too. The Sonia, as well, the Prime Minister told new rules won't cut infection rate, wanting them perhaps to go further, despite what Isabel said. And certainly we heard from the Prime Minister tonight, didn't we, that we are a freedom-loving country, but there have been too many breaches, he said, too many opportunities for the virus to slip through.
Well, I think some of those breaches, I mean, first of all, the evidence is actually that the public were very compliant during the first sort of 3 months of lockdown before it was relaxed. So I think some of the infection rates going up that we've seen is partly because actually there's been quite confusing messaging from the government over the summer. Also, there have been huge problems in the government's track and trace scheme, which is what we really needed in place to ask people to self-isolate who've got symptoms, who've tested positive, or who have come into contact with somebody who's tested positive. So big problems with that. I would just pick up on a couple of things that Isabel said, though. First of all, we know it's not possible to shield the most vulnerable in society because lots of them rely on professional care in care homes and at home. So it's just not possible to keep out the outside world. And that's why earlier this year, we saw such terrible death rates in care homes. So to just say we just shield older and vulnerable people and everyone else get on with it, that will lead to older people dying. So it doesn't work. We know that, and we know that from earlier this year. I think the other thing to pick up on is, that it's true that there is divergence in sort of what medics say, but I think the balance of medical advice and expert advice is very much in the court of we need to increase restrictions now. So you're always going to be able to point to the handful of experts that disagree with that. And I think the fact that we've got stories in tomorrow's papers, which I think we'll come on to, which says that actually Chris Whitty, the chief medical officer, was falling more into line with what Scotland's chief medical officer recommended, i.e. in favour of more restrictions on households mixing. I think that reflects the balance of medical and expert opinion in this country.
Yes, indeed. The Times, their main headline is "A struggle humanity will win," but there on the front page, house visits might need to be banned, says top medic, exactly the point you're making. Many people, therefore, Isabel, do not agree with you. They'd like to perhaps see a shorter, sharper initial mini lockdown and stop people mingling in homes, which seems to be one route that the virus is spreading. How would you feel if that indeed was brought in by this Prime Minister?
Well, I think it would be outrageous. And yes, of course, many people don't agree with a softer approach because they're frightened, because the government has entirely unnecessarily terrified the nation about this. And, you know, I'm interested to know from Sonia.
Do you mind if I step in? Do you really genuinely believe people are scared because of what the Prime Minister says? It's not because of their own experiences, that actually they might have lost relatives or know people who've had it badly or people who have long COVID?
Of course they're scared because of what the Prime Minister says. I'm not for a minute dismissing, as I've said before, that this is a nasty virus, but the actual death rate, do you know how many people under the age of 60 who do not have a pre-existing health condition have died from this? Do you know how many that is?
I don't.
Well, it's about 300, 307 to be precise. So those are the type of figures we're talking about in relation to people under the age of 60 who are not already suffering from some kind of serious health condition. So it seems to me completely disproportionate. And I would just like to know from Sonia, if at this time next year we still have no vaccine, do you propose we're still doing this?
I want to come back to this point, actually, about the numbers who are dying under 60 without pre-existing conditions. First of all, that sort of argument suggests that if you've got a pre-existing condition and you're under 60, or if you're over 60, your life doesn't matter at all. We've seen over 60,000 excess deaths here in the UK. Well, that's exactly what that argument does say to me, because we're not talking about deaths amongst a subset of the population. We're talking about the number of deaths we've seen as a whole, and it's been incredibly high here in the UK. At the peak, we saw the same numbers of people die per day from COVID that would be equivalent to 2 jumbo jets crashing every day. That's the scale of what we're talking about. So this is something that we have to take incredibly seriously. So I think that's kind of very important to bear in mind. And the other thing to say is that while death rates may be low amongst young people without pre-existing conditions, we do know from emerging medical evidence that there are some people who end up with very long-term symptoms of COVID. It can lead to extreme fatigue, for example, months later. So we're only just kind of learning about this virus and the long-term damage it can do. But I just don't think actually that, I think that you can point to a small number of experts, as I said, who take the contrary view. But I think the balance of medical opinion is in one direction. And I don't think medical experts are coming up with their advice based on fear or based on government messaging. I think they're looking at what's happened worldwide, they're looking at death rates, and they're coming up with some very reasonable conclusions.
Yes, and
so you haven't answered my question. You haven't answered my question about where we'll be this time next year. Do you want to run and hide from this thing in perpetuity in the hope of a vaccine?
I think it will be a very difficult position if we don't have a vaccine, but I think we will have to continue to monitor. I don't think it's right what you say, that this is going to go on for 6 months without a review. Of course, if we're in a better place in 2 months, the government will lift restrictions. We have to keep monitoring this. We have to keep reviewing it. I actually feel quite hopeful from what our experts are saying that we will have some sort of vaccine available by next spring, and I think that's what we have to hope for.
And I think specifically, obviously, being indoors over autumn and winter is a breeding ground for respiratory illnesses, and that is the specific problem with the time of the year we're currently in, unlike the summer. The Guardian, follow new restrictions or risk a second lockdown, but also talking about the economic impact of this, the furlough scheme. A German-style scheme could replace furlough, which is interesting, isn't it? Because this is what some people have demanded or asked for, which is a German-style wage subsidy. How do you feel about that, Isabel?
Well, I think it's very difficult to be increasing restrictions just as you're about to decrease economic support. I think the Chancellor is in an incredibly tricky position. There's speculation that he won't actually have a autumn budget in the normal way because it's so difficult to actually know what to say at this point when the picture is moving so rapidly. So I think the Chancellor will have to come up with some other form of support scheme for those sectors that are effectively being, unilaterally shut down by these measures.
Only just 1 minute left, Sonia. Two stories kind of related. One is, of course, Sir Keir Starmer's big day today. That's inside the Mirror. The front page is, though, about Boris's political leadership in all of this, which is something that Keir Starmer can beat Boris around the head in for the next few years before an election, can't he? They will always go back to this moment.
I think they will, and I think it is a big risk for Boris Johnson, and I think you see that in the polls and what's happened to his ratings in recent weeks. I think it was really interesting to see sort of Keir Starmer's speech today, particularly his pitch. He was very sort of clearly distancing himself from Jeremy Corbyn. Of course, you would expect any Labour leader to do so, given the crushing defeat that Labour suffered in late 2019. But I think the tricky thing for Keir Starmer, he's clearly going for quite a measured tone in all of this, but he is not yet setting out specific policies for Labour, so we didn't really see too many of those in his speech. And I think this moment in a parliament is always a tricky time for oppositions. You're in the first few months of a new parliament, and you've got a long road to go. It's probably going to be another 4 years until the next general election. So Keir Starmer has to sort of hold on to the improvement in the polls that he's seen without sort of getting too specific at this moment in time, or so Labour's thinking goes.
Sonia?
So I think he's done well so far, but I think it is a tricky moment for Labour.
We'll have longer at 11:30. That was a specially extended news at 10. We will see you then. Look forward to it. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.